1 hour before our company's IPO was set to go live, I walked into the boardroom expecting to sign the final papers that would make me worth $50 million. Instead, I found my business partner's identical twin brother sitting in my chair, wearing my presentation suit and holding documents that had my signature forged at the bottom. By the time I realized what was happening, $500 million had vanished into thin air, and I was being escorted out of my own building by security. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Margaret Chen had always been the numbers person. While other kids were playing video games, she was calculating compound interest on her allowance and reading Warren Buffett's annual letters to shareholders. By 15, she'd built a small portfolio trading penny stocks with money from her part-time job at a local diner in Tucson, Arizona. Her parents, both immigrants who worked double shifts to make ends meet, didn't understand her obsession with financial markets, but they supported her dream of attending business school. At Stanford, Margaret met Ethan Rodriguez during her junior year. He was everything she wasn't: charismatic, well-connected, and born into money. His father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across California, and Ethan had grown up attending charity galas and country club events. Despite their different backgrounds, they bonded over late-night study sessions and a shared vision of revolutionizing the financial technology sector. Their friendship deepened when they both landed internships at Goldman Sachs the summer before their senior year. While Margaret excelled at analyzing market trends and building complex financial models, Ethan had a natural gift for networking and client relations. They made an effective team, with Margaret handling the technical aspects while Ethan charmed potential investors and partners. The idea for their company, Nexus Financial Technologies, came to Margaret during a particularly frustrating experience trying to help her parents navigate a loan application. Traditional banks had rejected their application 3 times, despite their steady income and perfect payment history. The problem wasn't their creditworthiness. It was the outdated algorithms and bureaucratic processes that failed to account for immigrants' unique financial situations. Margaret spent months developing a proprietary AI system that could assess creditworthiness using alternative data points. Instead of relying solely on traditional credit scores, her algorithm analyzed spending patterns, utility payments, rent history, and even social media activity to create a more comprehensive picture of a person's financial reliability. The system was revolutionary, potentially opening up lending opportunities for millions of underserved consumers. Ethan was immediately enthusiastic about the concept. He helped Margaret refine her business plan and introduced her to several potential investors. From his family's network, his connections proved invaluable. Within 6 months of graduation, they'd secured their first round of seed funding, $3 million from a group of angel investors led by Ethan's family friend Victoria Blackwood, a prominent venture capitalist known for backing disruptive fintech startups. They established their headquarters in a converted warehouse in Austin, Texas, choosing the location for its growing tech scene and lower operational costs compared to Silicon Valley. Margaret threw herself into building the technical infrastructure while Ethan focused on business development and marketing. Their complementary skills seemed perfectly aligned, and their friendship provided a solid foundation for their business partnership. The early days were intense but exhilarating. Margaret would arrive at the office before sunrise and often didn't leave until well past midnight. She assembled a team of brilliant engineers and data scientists, many of whom she'd recruited from top-tier universities. Her background in mathematics and computer science allowed her to guide the technical development while ensuring the product remained true to her original vision. Ethan, meanwhile, was building relationships with potential corporate clients and preparing for their next funding round. His natural charisma and polished presentation skills made him the perfect spokesperson for the company. He could explain Margaret's complex algorithms in simple terms that resonated with non-technical investors and clients. Their first major breakthrough came 18 months after launching, when Nexus secured a partnership with Midwest Community Bank, a regional institution with over 200 branches across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. The bank agreed to pilot Margaret's lending algorithm for their small business loan program. Within 6 months, the pilot had reduced default rates by 37%, while increasing loan approvals for qualified applicants by 42%. The success of the Midwest partnership opened doors to larger opportunities. Major banks began reaching out, interested in licensing Margaret's technology for their own lending operations. Ethan negotiated these deals with impressive skill, securing favorable terms that protected their intellectual property while generating significant revenue streams. By their 3rd year, Nexus had grown from Margaret's original team of 6 to over 150 employees. They'd expanded beyond lending algorithms to develop a comprehensive suite of financial technology tools, including fraud detection systems, automated investment platforms, and mobile banking applications. Margaret's role had evolved from hands-on developer to chief technology officer, overseeing multiple engineering teams while continuing to drive innovation. The company's rapid growth attracted attention from major venture capital firms. Ethan spent countless hours in boardrooms and conference calls, negotiating increasingly large funding rounds. Series A brought in $25 million, followed by Series B at $60 million, then Series C at $125 million. Each round valued the company higher, reflecting the market's confidence in their technology and growth potential. Margaret's personal stake in the company had grown to represent a paper value of approximately $50 million by the time they began discussing an initial public offering. The IPO would allow early investors to cash out while providing Nexus with the capital needed to expand internationally and compete with established financial giants like J.P. Morgan Chase and Bank of America. Throughout this period of explosive growth, Margaret noticed subtle changes in her relationship with Ethan. Business decisions that had once been collaborative became increasingly one-sided, with Ethan making pronouncements about company direction without consulting her first. He'd begun referring to himself as the visionary behind Nexus, while describing Margaret as the technical implementer of his ideas. These tensions came to a head during a board meeting 6 months before the planned IPO. Ethan presented a strategic plan that would shift the company's focus away from serving underbanked communities toward developing premium financial products for wealthy clients. Margaret argued passionately against this direction, reminding the board that their original mission was to democratize access to financial services. Ethan dismissed her concerns with a condescending smile, suggesting that she didn't understand the big picture of business strategy. Several board members, all of whom Ethan had recruited through his network, sided with his position. Margaret felt increasingly isolated, despite being the person whose innovations had made the company's success possible. The final months before the IPO were marked by intense preparation and mounting stress. Margaret worked closely with investment bankers to prepare the technical documentation required for regulatory filings, while Ethan managed the roadshow presentations to potential institutional investors. The process was exhausting, requiring them to defend every aspect of their business model to skeptical Wall Street analysts. Despite their personal tensions, Margaret remained committed to the company's success. She'd poured 5 years of her life into building Nexus, sacrificing relationships and personal time to create something meaningful. The IPO represented not just financial success, but validation of her vision to make financial services more accessible and equitable. The week before the public offering, Margaret received several concerning reports from her engineering team. There were unusual patterns in their system logs, suggesting that someone had been accessing proprietary algorithms without authorization. When she brought these concerns to Ethan, he assured her that he would investigate personally, claiming it was probably just routine security testing by their IT department. Margaret's unease grew when she discovered that Ethan had been having private meetings with board members and key investors, conversations from which she was deliberately excluded. When she confronted him about these meetings, he claimed they were routine discussions about post-IPO strategy that didn't require her input. 3 days before the IPO launch, Margaret learned something that would change everything. While reviewing final legal documents in the company's conference room, she overheard a phone conversation between Ethan and someone whose voice sounded remarkably similar to his own. The conversation was brief, but alarming. They were discussing timing and execution, and something about Margaret won't know until it's too late. When Ethan ended the call and noticed Margaret in the doorway, his expression shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like guilt. He quickly explained that he'd been talking to his cousin about a family matter, but Margaret's instincts told her something wasn't right. She'd never heard Ethan mention having a cousin, and the voice on the phone had sounded too similar to Ethan's own. That evening, Margaret decided to conduct her own investigation. Using her administrative access to the company's systems, she began tracing the unauthorized access patterns her team had discovered. What she found made her blood run cold. The intrusions weren't coming from outside hackers, but from someone with intimate knowledge of their system architecture and security protocols. The digital fingerprints led to access logs that didn't match any of their current employees. Someone had been systematically copying their most valuable intellectual property, including the source code for Margaret's revolutionary lending algorithms. The timing of these breaches coincided perfectly with Ethan's mysterious private meetings. Margaret spent the night analyzing the evidence, trying to understand what was happening to her company. The pattern that emerged was both sophisticated and terrifying. Someone was preparing to steal everything she'd built, and they were planning to do it right before the IPO would make her technology worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Dawn broke over Austin on the morning before the IPO launch. Margaret realized she was walking into a trap that had been years in the making. But she had no idea how deep the deception ran, or that the person she'd trusted most was about to reveal a secret that would destroy everything she'd worked for. Margaret arrived at the Nexus headquarters at 6 a.m, 2 hours before the scheduled IPO signing ceremony. The building was eerily quiet, with only security personnel and a few early arriving caterers preparing for what should have been the most important day in the company's history. She clutched a manila folder containing printouts of the unauthorized access logs and system breaches she'd discovered during her sleepless night of investigation. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Her plan was simple: confront Ethan privately before the ceremonies began, present the evidence of corporate espionage, and demand answers. If necessary, she was prepared to delay the IPO until they could investigate the security breaches thoroughly. Losing millions in delayed launch costs was better than going public with compromised intellectual property. Margaret used her keycard to access the executive floor, expecting to find Ethan's office empty. Instead, she heard voices coming from the main conference room, the same room where they'd held their first board meeting 5 years earlier, where they'd celebrated their first major client, where they'd planned their path to becoming a publicly traded company. She approached the conference room quietly, recognizing Ethan's voice but hearing responses from someone whose speech patterns were identical, yet somehow different. Through the partially open door, Margaret glimpsed 2 figures seated at the mahogany table, both wearing identical navy suits, both with the same dark hair and angular features. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was seeing. Ethan was sitting across from another man who looked exactly like him. Not similar, not related, but identical in every physical detail. They were reviewing documents spread across the table, documents that Margaret recognized as containing proprietary algorithms and client information. "The transfer protocols are in place," the second man was saying, his voice a perfect match for Ethan's. "Once the IPO goes live and the first trades execute, we'll have approximately 47 minutes before anyone notices the discrepancies in the financial records." Ethan nodded, checking his watch. "Margaret should arrive soon. Remember, you know everything I know about the company. She can't suspect anything during the signing ceremony. The moment she realizes what's happening, This entire operation falls apart. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain they would hear it. The second man stood up, and she got a clearer view of his face. He wasn't just similar to Ethan, he was physically identical, down to the small scar above his left eyebrow that Ethan had gotten during a childhood bicycle accident. "I've been studying her mannerisms and speech patterns for months," the doppelganger continued. "The board members won't notice the difference, especially during the chaos of the IPO launch. By the time anyone realizes I'm not you, the funds will be dispersed across 17 different offshore accounts, and the real Ethan Rodriguez will be boarding a flight to the Cayman Islands." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Margaret wasn't looking at Ethan's twin brother or some long-lost relative. She was witnessing an elaborate impersonation scheme that had been planned for months, possibly years. But how was such a perfect physical duplication possible? Ethan pulled out his phone and scrolled through what appeared to be a detailed timeline. The surgical procedures were worth every penny. Dr. Harrison's work in Switzerland is truly remarkable. Even Margaret won't be able to tell the difference during the brief interaction we'll have today. Margaret's mind reeled. Plastic surgery. Someone had undergone extensive surgical procedures to look exactly like Ethan, down to minute details that would be impossible to replicate through conventional means. This wasn't just corporate theft. It was an elaborate con game involving medical procedures, forged documents, and carefully orchestrated identity theft. The fake Ethan continued reviewing documents. "Once the IPO funds are secured, we'll initiate the second phase. The authentic Ethan Rodriguez will disappear, presumably killed in a boating accident off the coast of Nassau. I'll return to Austin as the grieving survivor, inheriting his shares, and maintaining control of the company. Margaret will be too distraught to notice the subtle behavioral changes." Margaret felt sick. They weren't just planning to steal company funds, they were planning to murder Ethan and replace him permanently. But something didn't make sense. If this was an elaborate scheme to replace Ethan, why was the real Ethan participating willingly? Her question was answered when Ethan spoke again. "My gambling debts to the Kozlov organization were going to get me killed anyway. This way, I get to disappear with enough money to start over somewhere they'll never find me. You get a new identity. And a fortune. Margaret gets what she deserves for being so naive about business partnerships." The callousness in his voice was like a physical blow. Margaret realized that her business partner, the person she'd trusted with her innovations and her future, had been planning her downfall for months. The unauthorized system access, the private meetings, the gradual marginalization of her role, it had all been preparation for this moment. She needed to get out of the building immediately and contact authorities, but her legs felt frozen. Through the gap in the door, she watched the two men continuing their preparation. The imposter was practicing Ethan's signature, perfecting the slight leftward slant and the distinctive way he dotted his eyes. "What about the engineering team?" the fake Ethan asked. "Margaret's people are extremely loyal to her. If they start asking questions about technical decisions," Ethan waved dismissively, "most of them will quit within 6 months once they realize the company's new direction. The ones who stay will be too focused on their stock options to cause problems. Remember, after today, we control 51% of voting shares. Margaret's technical expertise becomes irrelevant once we have legal control." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the quiet hallway. She quickly silenced it, but the damage was done. The conversation in the conference room stopped abruptly. "Did you hear something?" the imposter asked. Margaret didn't wait to hear Ethan's response. She turned and ran toward the stairwell, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Behind her, she heard the conference room door opening and footsteps pursuing her. She reached the stairwell and began descending rapidly, taking steps 2 at a time. Her mind raced faster than her feet. Who could she call? The police would need evidence beyond her word. And by the time they investigated, the IPO would be complete and the funds would be gone. The FBI would require proof of federal crimes, documentation she didn't have time to gather. Margaret reached the parking garage and ran to her car, fumbling with her keys. As she started the engine, she saw Ethan emerge from the stairwell, his eyes scanning the garage. She ducked low in her seat, praying he wouldn't spot her vehicle among the dozens of cars. Her phone showed 7 missed calls from the investment banking team and 3 text messages asking about her location. The IPO signing ceremony was scheduled to begin in 90 minutes, and her absence would raise immediate questions. But if she attended the ceremony, she would be walking directly into the trap. Margaret drove out of the garage slowly, trying not to attract attention. Once she was safely away from the building, she pulled into a nearby coffee shop parking lot and tried to think clearly. She needed evidence that would prove the impersonation scheme, but more importantly, she needed to prevent the theft of $500 million. Her first call was to Victoria Blackwood, the venture capitalist who had been their earliest major investor. Victoria had been in the industry for over 20 years and had seen every type of corporate fraud imaginable. If anyone would believe Margaret's story and know how to respond quickly, it would be her. Victoria, this is Margaret Chen. I need to speak with you immediately about the IPO. There's been a major development. Victoria's voice was crisp and professional. Margaret, I'm actually in the car heading to your offices right now. Can this wait until after the ceremony? No, it absolutely cannot wait. Someone is planning to steal the IPO funds and they're using an elaborate impersonation scheme. Ethan has been replaced by someone who's had plastic surgery to look exactly like him. There was a long pause. Margaret could hear traffic noise in the background and assumed Victoria was processing the information. Margaret, that's an extremely serious accusation. Are you certain about what you're saying? The financial implications of delaying this IPO would be enormous. Margaret quickly summarized what she'd witnessed in the conference room, describing the identical appearance, the conversation about surgical procedures, and the planned timeline for fund transfers. Victoria listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details. If what you're telling me is true, we need to involve law enforcement immediately, Victoria said. But we also need irrefutable proof before we can halt the IPO. Too many people have too much money invested in this launch. Margaret explained about the unauthorized system access and the evidence she'd gathered during her overnight investigation. Victoria agreed to meet her at a neutral location to review the documentation before deciding how to proceed. They met at a law office in downtown Austin, where Victoria had arranged for a securities attorney to join them. Margaret presented her evidence: system logs showing unauthorized access, email records of Ethan's suspicious meetings, and detailed financial records that revealed unexplained transactions in the weeks leading up to the IPO. The attorney, Diana Walsh, was a specialist in corporate fraud cases. She reviewed Margaret's documentation carefully, asking pointed questions about the technical aspects of the security breaches and the timeline of suspicious activities. This evidence suggests systematic preparation for corporate theft, Diana concluded. But the impersonation claim is going to be difficult to prove without physical evidence or witness testimony. Courts don't typically accept plastic surgery conspiracy theories without substantial proof. Margaret felt her hopes sinking. Even with the evidence she'd gathered, proving the identity switch would be nearly impossible without catching the imposter in the act. Victoria checked her watch. We have 45 minutes before the signing ceremony begins. If we're going to stop this, we need to act now. Diana outlined their options. They could contact the FBI and request an emergency investigation, but that would likely take hours to initiate and would definitely halt the IPO. They could contact local police, but corporate identity theft fell outside their typical jurisdiction. Or they could attend the ceremony and try to expose the fraud publicly, risking everything if Margaret's accusations were wrong. There's one more option, Margaret said quietly. I could go to the ceremony as planned and try to get the imposter to reveal himself. If I can get him to admit to the scheme in front of witnesses, we'd have the proof we need. Victoria shook her head. That's extremely dangerous. If these people are planning murder, they won't hesitate to harm you if they realize you know about their scheme. Margaret understood the risk, but she also understood that hundreds of employees and thousands of investors were counting on this IPO. If she didn't act, not only would the theft succeed, but innocent people would lose their life savings when the fraud was eventually discovered. Diana suggested a compromise. What if we wire you for sound and have law enforcement standing by? You could attend the ceremony while we monitor the situation from nearby. If you can get them to incriminate themselves, we'll have audio evidence. Margaret agreed to the plan, though she knew it would require her to maintain perfect composure while confronting people who had planned her destruction. As they prepared to leave the law office, her phone rang with another call from the investment banking team. Margaret, where are you? The banker's voice was tense. We're 30 minutes from launch, and we need all principals present for the final documentation. Margaret took a deep breath. I'm on my way. Just had to handle a last-minute emergency. As she hung up, Victoria placed a hand on her shoulder. Are you sure you want to do this? Once you walk into that room, there's no going back. Margaret thought about the 5 years she'd spent building Nexus, the employees who depended on the company's success, and the millions of underserved consumers who could benefit from her technology. She thought about Ethan's betrayal and the imposter who was planning to steal everything she'd worked for. I have to do this, she said. It's not just about the money. It's about making sure that innovation and hard work still matter more than elaborate theft schemes. Margaret left the law office wearing a concealed recording device, knowing she was about to walk into the most dangerous situation of her life. Behind her, Victoria and Diana were coordinating with law enforcement, preparing for whatever would unfold in the next hour. The drive back to Nexus headquarters felt surreal. The streets of Austin looked the same as they had that morning, but Margaret felt like she was seeing everything through different eyes. She was no longer the naive entrepreneur who had trusted her business partner completely. She was someone who had discovered the depths of human deception and was prepared to fight back. As she pulled into the parking garage, Margaret saw dozens of expensive cars belonging to investors, board members, and banking executives. The IPO ceremony would be attended by some of the most powerful people in the financial industry. If her plan worked, they would witness the exposure of one of the most elaborate corporate fraud schemes in recent history. If her plan failed, she would likely be discredited, ruined, or worse. Margaret walked toward the elevator, knowing that the next hour would determine not just her own future, but the fate of everyone who had believed in her vision. The elevator doors opened to reveal a bustling scene of controlled chaos. The executive floor had been transformed into a sophisticated ceremonial space, with photographers positioning lighting equipment, caterers arranging champagne displays, and financial executives reviewing last-minute documentation. Margaret recognized faces from the most prestigious investment banks on Wall Street, venture capital firms that managed billions in assets, and technology journalists who would broadcast news of the IPO to millions of viewers. At the center of it all stood the imposter, greeting guests with Ethan's characteristic confidence and charm. Margaret watched him from across the room, studying his mannerisms for any telltale signs of deception. His posture was perfect, his handshake firm, his smile genuine. Even knowing the truth, she found it difficult to believe this wasn't the man she'd worked alongside for 5 years. The recording device taped to her ribs felt heavy and obvious, though Diana Walsh had assured her it was completely undetectable. Margaret touched her collar nervously, ensuring the tiny microphone remained properly positioned. Somewhere outside the building, FBI agents were monitoring the audio feed, ready to intervene if the situation became dangerous. Margaret! Victoria. Blackwood approached with her usual professional warmth, though Margaret detected tension in her voice. You look lovely. Are you feeling prepared for this momentous day? The coded question was Victoria's way of confirming that Margaret was ready to proceed with their plan. Margaret nodded subtly, then made her way toward the imposter who was holding court near the signing table. "Ethan," she called out, watching his reaction carefully. He turned with a brilliant smile that looked exactly like the expression she'd seen thousands of times before. "Margaret, there you are. I was starting to worry." He approached and embraced her, the gesture feeling simultaneously familiar and alien. "Sorry, I had some last-minute technical issues to resolve," Margaret replied, testing his knowledge. The quantum encryption protocols were showing anomalies in the beta environment. It was a completely fabricated technical problem, something that would be meaningless to anyone without deep knowledge of their systems. The real Ethan would have immediately recognized the nonsense terminology. The imposter nodded thoughtfully. "Of course, the quantum protocols. I'm sure your team handled it brilliantly as always." Margaret's heart raced. The real Ethan would have questioned her immediately about quantum encryption, a technology they'd never implemented. This confirmed that she was speaking to someone with only surface-level knowledge of their technical operations. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Richard Sterling, the lead investment banker from Goldman Sachs. "If we could gather around the signing table, we're ready to begin the ceremony." The room quieted as approximately 30 people formed a semicircle around the mahogany table where the IPO documents were arranged. Margaret positioned herself directly across from the imposter, maintaining eye contact as they approached their seats. Sterling began his prepared remarks about the significance of the moment, praising Nexus Financial Technologies for their innovative approach to democratizing financial services. Margaret barely heard the words, focused entirely on the man sitting across from her. "Before we begin the signing," Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "I'd like to share something with everyone here." Sterling looked surprised by the interruption, but nodded for her to continue. The imposter's expression remained calm, though Margaret noticed his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. 5 years ago, Ethan and I started this company with a simple mission: to help people who had been failed by traditional banking systems. Margaret spoke directly to the imposter, watching his reactions. "Do you remember our first client meeting, Ethan? The elderly couple from San Antonio who had been rejected for a home refinancing loan despite 30 years of perfect payment history?" The imposter smiled confidently. "Of course I remember. That meeting inspired everything we built here." Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction. The real Ethan would have corrected her immediately. Their first client was a small business owner from Houston, not an elderly couple from San Antonio. She'd deliberately provided false information to test his knowledge. "That's interesting," Margaret continued, "because I distinctly remember you telling that story differently just yesterday." She addressed the room while keeping her eyes on the imposter. "In fact, I'm beginning to wonder if the person sitting across from me really knows our company's history at all." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. Conversation stopped, and Margaret could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes focused on the interaction between her and the imposter. "Margaret, I'm not sure what you're implying," the imposter replied, his voice maintaining Ethan's characteristic calm tone. "Perhaps you're feeling nervous about the IPO. It's certainly understandable given the magnitude of what we're accomplishing today." Victoria Blackwood stepped forward. "Margaret, perhaps we should proceed with the ceremony. These concerns can be addressed privately afterward." Margaret recognized Victoria's signal. She needed to escalate the confrontation before the imposter could deflect suspicion or end the meeting. "I spent last night reviewing our security logs," Margaret announced to the room. "Someone has been systematically accessing our proprietary algorithms without authorization. The intrusions show intimate knowledge of our system architecture, but the access patterns don't match any current employee." Richard Sterling looked concerned. "Margaret, are you suggesting there's been a security breach? That would have significant implications for the IPO." "I'm suggesting something much more serious than a security breach," Margaret replied. She pulled out her phone and opened the audio recording she'd made that morning. I'm suggesting that the person claiming to be Ethan Rodriguez is not who he appears to be. She pressed play, and the imposter's voice filled the room. The transfer protocols are in place. Once the IPO goes live and the first trades execute, we'll have approximately 47 minutes before anyone notices the discrepancies in the financial records. The reaction was immediate and electric. Board members began talking at once, investors pulled out their phones, and the imposter's composed expression finally cracked. That recording has been altered, he said quickly. Margaret is obviously having some kind of breakdown. The stress of going public has affected her judgment. Margaret continued playing the audio. The room heard the discussion of surgical procedures, the planned murder of the real Ethan, and the detailed timeline for stealing the IPO funds. Diana Walsh, who had been standing near the back of the room, stepped forward and identified herself as a securities attorney. Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to remain calm while law enforcement addresses this situation. The imposter stood abruptly, his chair falling backward. This is ridiculous. Margaret is clearly suffering from paranoid delusions. She's trying to sabotage her own company's IPO. If you're really Ethan Rodriguez, Margaret said, standing to face him directly, then answer a simple question that only he would know. What was the name of your childhood dog, the one you told me about during our first year at Stanford? The imposter's eyes darted around the room, clearly searching for an escape route. I don't see how childhood memories are relevant to this business discussion. Because Ethan never had a childhood dog, Margaret replied. He was allergic to animals his entire life. It's a story I made up just now to test you. The room erupted in chaos. Several board members were shouting questions, investors were demanding explanations, and photographers were capturing everything. Through the confusion, Margaret saw the imposter reaching inside his jacket. He's got a weapon! Victoria screamed. The imposter pulled out what appeared to be a small device, pressing a button before anyone could stop him. Immediately, every electronic device in the room began emitting high-pitched warning sounds. Phones, laptops, and tablets displayed error messages as their screens flickered and died. Electromagnetic pulse device, Diana shouted over the chaos. He's destroying all electronic evidence. Margaret watched in horror as her phone screen went dark, along with every other device in the room. The imposter had just wiped out all the electronic documentation of the IPO, the banking records, and most importantly, the audio recording that proved his identity fraud. But Margaret had anticipated this possibility. During her preparation with Diana, they'd discussed the likelihood that sophisticated criminals would have contingency plans for destroying evidence. The recording device I'm wearing is hardened against electromagnetic interference, Margaret announced to the room. Everything that happened here today is still being transmitted to federal agents outside this building. The imposter's face showed a naked panic for the first time. He lunged toward the windows, apparently planning to break through the reinforced glass, but Sterling and two other men tackled him before he could reach them. As they wrestled the imposter to the ground, Margaret noticed something that made her blood run cold. During the struggle, a portion of his hairline had shifted, revealing the edge of what appeared to be an extremely sophisticated prosthetic scalp. "Look at his hairline," Margaret called out. The plastic surgery wasn't just facial reconstruction, they created an entirely artificial appearance. Diana was examining the imposter's face while the men held him down. "This is incredible workmanship. The surgical modifications go beyond anything I've seen in identity fraud cases. Someone invested millions of dollars in creating this deception." The room fell silent except for the imposter's labored breathing. Margaret looked at the man who had nearly destroyed everything she'd built, trying to understand the scope of the conspiracy she'd uncovered. "Where is the real Ethan Rodriguez?" she demanded. The imposter laughed bitterly. "You still don't understand how deep this goes, do you? Ethan Rodriguez has been dead for 6 months. I've been attending board meetings, signing documents, and sleeping in his apartment since October. Margaret felt the room spinning around her. 6 months. The person she'd been arguing with, planning with, and trusting with her company's future had been an imposter for half a year. Every decision, every conversation, every moment of friction between them had been orchestrated by a stranger. The real Ethan discovered some inconvenient information about certain investors' backgrounds. The imposter continued. Information that would have complicated today's financial arrangements. His accidental death was fortuitous for everyone involved. Victoria Blackwood stepped forward, her face pale. What kind of information? The kind that connects several of your board members to money laundering operations in Eastern Europe. Nexus Financial Technologies wasn't just going public. It was being prepared as a vehicle for washing hundreds of millions in illegal funds through legitimate American markets. Margaret sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the revelation that her company had been infiltrated at the highest levels. The IPO wasn't just being stolen, it was being used as part of an international criminal conspiracy. Through the conference room windows, she could see black SUVs surrounding the building. FBI agents in tactical gear were entering the lobby, following the audio signals that had been transmitted throughout the confrontation. Richard Sterling was speaking urgently into a satellite phone, presumably communicating with his firm's legal department about the implications of the halted IPO. Other investors were huddled in small groups, discussing the financial and reputational consequences of being associated with what was clearly a major criminal operation. Margaret, Victoria approached her quietly. I need you to know that not everyone on the board was aware of this conspiracy. Some of us invested in Nexus because we genuinely believed in your technology and your mission. Margaret looked at Victoria skeptically. How do I know who to trust now? If Ethan was replaced 6 months ago and multiple board members were involved in money laundering, how many other people have been lying to me? The conference room doors opened, and FBI agents entered with weapons drawn. The lead agent identified herself as Special Agent Catherine Morrison, and she immediately began separating the attendees for individual questioning. As the imposter was handcuffed and led away, he looked back at Margaret one final time. You have no idea what you've just destroyed. Nexus was going to be worth billions, and you threw it all away for the sake of truth and justice. How naive can you be? Margaret watched him disappear into the elevator, surrounded by federal agents. The room that had been prepared for celebration was now a crime scene, with photographers documenting evidence instead of capturing milestone moments. Special Agent Morrison approached Margaret with a digital recorder. Ms. Chen, we're going to need a complete statement about everything you witnessed and discovered. Based on the audio we received, this appears to be part of a much larger international fraud operation. As Margaret began recounting the events that had led to this moment, she realized that exposing the conspiracy was only the beginning. The real work of determining which parts of her company were legitimate and which were criminal would take months or even years to complete. But for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe freely. The truth was finally out, and whatever happened next, she would face it as herself, not as the victim of an elaborate deception. The FBI field office in Austin felt like stepping into a different world. Margaret sat in a sterile interview room, fluorescent lights humming overhead, while Special Agent Catherine Morrison spread dozens of photographs across the metal table. Each image showed a different aspect of what the Bureau was calling Operation Mirror Image, the most sophisticated corporate identity theft case in federal history. We've been tracking unusual financial movements connected to Eastern European criminal organizations for 18 months, Morrison explained, pointing to a chart that looked like a spiderweb of interconnected shell companies. Your company appeared on our radar 6 months ago when large sums began flowing through accounts registered to Nexus subsidiaries that didn't officially exist. Margaret studied the photographs of bank statements, wire transfer records, and corporate documents. Many bore signatures she recognized as Ethan's, but now she understood they were forgeries created by his replacement. The individual you knew as the imposter is actually Viktor Petrov, a former intelligence operative from Belarus. He specializes in deep-cover identity assumption, becoming someone else so completely that even close family members can't tell. The difference. Morrison slid a thick file across the table. This is his psychological profile and surgical history. The file contained before and after photographs that made Margaret's stomach turn. Viktor Petrov had undergone 2 years of reconstructive surgery, bone restructuring, and even vocal cord modification to transform himself into Ethan's physical duplicate. The process had cost nearly $3 million and involved medical procedures in Switzerland, South Korea, and Brazil. How did they get access to Ethan's biological information? Margaret asked. Creating this level of physical mimicry would require detailed medical records, genetic analysis, even dental impressions. Morrison's expression darkened. We believe Ethan was being surveilled for over a year before his murder. Petrov's organization is known for extensive intelligence gathering. They probably had photographers documenting Ethan's daily routines, voice recordings from business meetings, even samples of his handwriting from discarded documents. The scope of the surveillance made Margaret feel violated on Ethan's behalf. Someone had been watching her business partner's every move, studying his mannerisms, and planning his replacement with methodical precision. What about the board members he mentioned? How many people were involved in this conspiracy? Morrison opened another file, this one containing photographs of people Margaret recognized from Nexus board meetings. We've identified at least 7 individuals within your company's leadership structure who were either active participants or unknowing facilitators of the money laundering operation. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized faces of people she'd worked with for years. James Harrison, the former banking executive who'd helped them navigate regulatory requirements. Sandra Reeves, the compliance officer who'd overseen their anti-fraud systems. Even Dr. Michael Huang, the technology advisor who'd helped her refine her algorithms. Dr. Huang was providing technical specifications to the criminal organization, Morrison continued. They needed detailed understanding of your proprietary systems to successfully integrate their money laundering protocols without triggering automated fraud detection. The betrayal felt personal and professional simultaneously. Margaret had trusted these people with her innovations, her company's future, and the financial security of hundreds of employees. Learning that they'd been systematically exploiting that trust was devastating. We need your help with the technical investigation, Morrison said. Your algorithms are so sophisticated that our cybercrime specialists can't fully understand how the money laundering systems were integrated. We need someone who knows the original code to identify what was modified. Margaret agreed to assist, though she dreaded discovering how extensively her life's work had been corrupted. They moved to a secured computer lab, where federal investigators had been analyzing Nexus's servers and databases. The lead cybercrime analyst, Special Agent David Kim, walked Margaret through their preliminary findings. The modifications to your lending algorithms were incredibly subtle. Instead of rejecting high-risk loan applications, the system was approving them and routing the funds through a network of shell companies. On the computer screen, Margaret could see her original code alongside the criminal modifications. The changes were elegant in their simplicity. Just a few lines of altered logic that transformed her tool for helping underserved communities into a mechanism for washing dirty money. Every loan approval generated a corresponding transaction in offshore accounts, Kim explained. The criminal organization would apply for legitimate business loans using false identities, receive approval through your modified system, then default on the loans while keeping the money. The losses were absorbed by your company's insurance policies. Margaret felt sick. Her technology, designed to help people access fair lending opportunities, had been weaponized to steal millions of dollars. Thousands of legitimate applicants had been denied loans so that criminal funds could flow through the system undetected. How much money are we talking about? She asked. Kim pulled up a spreadsheet showing transaction volumes over the past 6 months. conservative estimate is $430 million laundered through your systems. The actual amount could be significantly higher once we trace all the subsidiary accounts. The number was staggering. Margaret realized that her company had unknowingly become one of the largest money laundering operations in United States financial history. Morrison returned to the lab with updates from other aspects of the investigation. We've arrested 12 individuals connected to the conspiracy, including 3 board members and the surgeon who performed Petrov's transformation. We're also coordinating with international law enforcement to track down the broader criminal network. Margaret asked about Victoria Blackwood, hoping that at least one person she'd trusted remained legitimate. Victoria appears to be clean, Morrison confirmed. Her investment in Nexus was genuine, and she had no knowledge of the criminal activities. In fact, her quick response to your concerns this morning probably prevented an additional $100 million from being stolen. The relief was minimal but meaningful. At least one relationship from her professional life hadn't been built on deception. "What happens to Nexus now?" Margaret asked. "Do we have any hope of recovering as a legitimate company?" Morrison and Kim exchanged glances. "That's complicated," Morrison admitted. "Your intellectual property is legitimate and valuable, but the company's financial structure has been so compromised that rebuilding will be extremely difficult. Most of your current assets are considered proceeds of criminal activity and will be frozen during the investigation." Margaret understood the implications. Even though she was a victim of the conspiracy, her company would be treated as a criminal enterprise until investigators could separate legitimate business activities from illegal ones. The process could take years, during which Nexus would be unable to operate or generate revenue. "Your employees will need to find other work," Kim added. "We can't allow the company to continue operating while the investigation is ongoing. The technology systems have been so compromised that we can't risk continued criminal exploitation." Margaret thought about the 150 people who worked for Nexus, many of whom had joined the company because they believed in her mission of democratizing financial services. They would lose their jobs, their stock options, and their professional reputations through no fault of their own. "There is one piece of good news," Morrison said. "Because you exposed the conspiracy before the IPO completed, we were able to freeze the stolen funds before they disappeared into untraceable offshore accounts. Most of the $400 million will be recovered and returned to legitimate sources." The investigation continued for 3 more days. Margaret spent hours reviewing code, identifying criminal modifications, and helping federal agents understand the technical aspects of the fraud. The more she learned, the more impressed she became with the sophistication of the operation. The criminal organization had spent years planning every detail. They'd researched her background, studied her personality, and identified her psychological weaknesses. They knew she was more focused on technology than business relationships, making her vulnerable to deception by trusted partners. "They specifically targeted you because of your expertise," Morrison explained during one of their sessions. "Your algorithms were so advanced that they provided perfect cover for money laundering activities. Traditional banking systems would have detected the unusual transaction patterns, but your AI system was sophisticated enough to make the illegal transfers appear legitimate." Margaret realized she'd been chosen as a victim, not despite her intelligence, but because of it. Her innovations had made her valuable to criminals who needed cutting-edge technology to support their operations. On the 4th day, Morrison brought her a document that would change everything again. "We found Ethan Rodriguez," she said quietly. Margaret's heart stopped. "I thought you said he was murdered 6 months ago." "That's what Petrov wanted us to believe. The real Ethan is alive, but he's been held captive in a private medical facility in Switzerland. The criminal organization kept him alive because they needed access to his memories and mannerisms to train Petrov more effectively." The revelation was simultaneously heartbreaking and hopeful. Ethan was alive, but he'd spent 6 months as a prisoner while an imposter destroyed everything they'd built together. "Is he? Is he okay?" Margaret asked. "Physically, he's in good condition. Psychologically, He's been through significant trauma. The criminals used experimental drugs and psychological techniques to extract information about you, the company, and his personal relationships. He's going to need extensive rehabilitation. Morrison showed Margaret photographs of Ethan taken during his rescue by Swiss authorities. He looked gaunt and haunted, nothing like the confident entrepreneur she remembered. The man in the pictures had been broken by months of captivity and interrogation. He's been asking about you constantly since his rescue, Morrison continued. He wants to know if you're safe and whether you were able to save the company. Margaret felt tears building in her eyes. While she'd been fighting to expose the conspiracy, the real Ethan had been suffering in captivity, probably believing that his imposter was destroying everything he cared about. "When can I see him?" she asked. "He's being flown back to the United States tomorrow for medical evaluation and debriefing. Once doctors clear him for visitors, we'll arrange a meeting. But Margaret, you need to understand that he's not the same person you knew. This experience has changed him fundamentally." That evening, Margaret sat in her apartment overlooking downtown Austin, processing everything she'd learned. Her company was gone, her technology had been corrupted, and her business partner had been psychologically tortured for 6 months. The life she'd spent 5 years building had been completely destroyed by people she'd never met, for reasons that had nothing to do with her personal choices or professional decisions. But she was alive. The criminals had been caught. And Ethan would recover. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but at least she would face them with the truth instead of living inside an elaborate deception. For the first time in weeks, Margaret allowed herself to imagine what might come next. She still had her expertise, her reputation in the technology community, and her passion for helping underserved populations access financial services. The criminal organization had stolen her company, but they couldn't steal her knowledge or her determination to rebuild something meaningful from the wreckage. 6 months after the collapse of Nexus Financial Technologies, Margaret Chen walked through the corridors of Baylor Scott and White Medical Center in Dallas, carrying a bouquet of sunflowers and a folder containing architectural plans for a new office building. Today marked Ethan Rodriguez's final day of psychological rehabilitation and the beginning of the most important conversation of her life. Ethan's recovery had been slower than anyone anticipated. The experimental drugs used by his captors had affected his short-term memory, and the psychological manipulation had left him struggling with severe trust issues. For weeks after his rescue, he'd been unable to believe that Margaret wasn't another imposter sent to extract information from him. Dr. Sarah Patterson, his lead psychiatrist, had prepared Margaret for the meeting. Ethan's memories from before. His captivity are intact, but he experiences what we call reality fragmentation. Sometimes he's not certain whether his experiences are real or artificially implanted. He's going to test you constantly, looking for proof that you're genuinely Margaret and not another sophisticated deception. Margaret found Ethan sitting in the hospital's garden courtyard, sketching architectural drawings in a notebook. He looked healthier than in the rescue photographs, having regained weight and color in his face. But his eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there before. "Margaret," he said without looking up from his drawing. "Dr. Patterson said you were coming today. Are you real, or are you another test?" The question broke her heart. Margaret sat beside him on the bench, maintaining careful distance to avoid triggering his anxiety. "I'm real, Ethan, but I understand why you'd need to verify that." He studied her face intently, then asked a question that only the real Margaret would know the answer to. "What did you say to me the night before our first board meeting, when you were having a panic attack about presenting to investors?" Margaret smiled at the memory. "I said that I'd rather be debugging code at 3 a.m. than trying to convince rich people that my algorithms were worth their money. You told me that rich people were just scared humans with better accountants." Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly. "That sounds like something I would say." He closed his notebook and looked at her directly for the first time. "The FBI told me what you did, how you figured out that Victor wasn't me. How you stopped the IPO. How you saved everyone's money. I should have figured it out sooner, Margaret replied. If I'd been paying closer attention to the changes in your behavior, maybe I could have prevented— Stop, Ethan interrupted. Victor studied me for over a year. He knew things about my childhood that I'd forgotten myself. The fact that you detected the deception at all is remarkable. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching patients and visitors walking through the garden paths. Margaret had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but now that the moment had arrived, she wasn't sure how to begin. I brought you something, she said finally, handing him the folder. Architectural plans for a new office building in San Antonio, 20,000 square feet, designed specifically for a financial technology company. Ethan opened the folder and examined the drawings. These are beautiful, but Margaret, we don't have company anymore. Nexus is gone. I want to start over, Margaret said. New company, new mission, new technology. I've spent the last 6 months developing algorithms that are even more advanced than what we had before. This time, I want to build something that can't be corrupted by criminals. She pulled out her laptop and showed him preliminary code for what she was calling transparent finance, a completely open-source lending platform where every transaction would be publicly visible and auditable. In real time, the beauty of full transparency is that money laundering becomes impossible, Margaret explained. Criminals rely on opacity to hide their activities. If every loan, every approval, every payment is visible to regulators and the public, illegal, transactions become immediately obvious. Ethan studied the code with growing excitement. Despite his psychological trauma, his analytical mind remained sharp. This is brilliant. You're essentially crowdsourcing fraud detection by making the entire system transparent. Exactly. And there's more. Margaret showed him partnerships she'd negotiated with 3 community banks and a credit union. They're willing to pilot the system with real customers. We can launch with actual lending operations instead of just theoretical technology. For the first time since his rescue, Ethan smiled genuinely. You've been busy while I've been in therapy. Margaret had indeed been busy. While Ethan recovered, she'd been rebuilding her professional life from scratch. The FBI had cleared her of any wrongdoing in the Nexus conspiracy, but her reputation in the financial technology community had been damaged by association with the scandal. Many venture capitalists were hesitant to invest in anything connected to the Nexus case. Margaret had been forced to bootstrap her new company using personal savings and small investments from individual supporters who believed in her vision. Victoria Blackwood wants to meet with us next week, Margaret continued. She's interested in leading a Series A funding round, but only if you're involved as co-founder. She says the technology is impressive, but she invests in teams, not just individuals. Ethan looked uncertain. Margaret, I don't know if I'm ready to trust investors again. Victor manipulated me by exploiting my relationships with board members. How do I know that won't happen again? It was a fair concern. Margaret had struggled with similar trust issues, questioning every potential partner and investor. The experience of being systematically deceived had made both of them hypersensitive to manipulation. We do background checks, Margaret replied. Not just financial and professional verification, but psychological profiling, social media analysis, even interviews with their personal references. If someone wants access to our company, they submit to the same level of scrutiny that criminals used against us. Ethan laughed, the first time she'd heard that sound since his rescue. Fighting paranoia with more paranoia. I like it. They spent the next hour reviewing Margaret's business plan, technical specifications, and financial projections. The new company would start smaller than Nexus, focusing on a specific market segment rather than trying to revolutionize the entire financial industry. What about the employees from Nexus? Ethan asked. Are any of them interested in joining the new company? Margaret had maintained contact with dozens of former colleagues who'd lost their jobs when Nexus was shut down. Many had found work at Other companies, but several key engineers and designers were eager to reunite with Margaret and Ethan. "I've got commitments from 15 people, including most of our core development team," she said. "They're willing to take reduced salaries in exchange for significant equity stakes. Everyone wants to rebuild what we lost." The conversation continued. As they walked through the hospital corridors toward the exit, Ethan was being discharged that afternoon, moving to a supervised apartment in Austin where he would continue outpatient therapy while gradually returning to normal life. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as they reached the hospital's main entrance. The FBI recovered most of the stolen money from the criminal organization. They're establishing a victim compensation fund for people who were harmed by investment fraud schemes. "We're eligible for up to $10 million to help restart our operations." Ethan stopped walking. $10 million from the government? "Money that was stolen from legitimate investors and businesses," Margaret clarified. "The Justice Department wants to support companies that were victimized by organized crime. They see our new transparency-focused approach as a model for preventing future financial fraud." As they stood outside the medical center, Margaret realized how much both of their lives had changed. 6 months earlier, they'd been preparing for an IPO that would have made them wealthy, but ultimately destroyed their integrity. Now they were starting over with limited resources but unlimited potential for creating something meaningful. "So," Ethan said, extending his hand for a formal handshake, "Margaret Chen, would you like to be my business partner again?" Margaret shook his hand firmly. "Ethan Rodriguez, I thought you'd never ask." They walked toward Margaret's car, discussing plans for the new company headquarters, hiring timelines, and product development milestones. The conversation felt familiar yet different. They were the same people who had founded Nexus 5 years earlier, but they'd been tested by circumstances that had revealed their true character. The criminal conspiracy had been designed to exploit their weaknesses and destroy their relationship. Instead, it had strengthened their partnership and clarified their shared values. They'd learned that success without integrity was meaningless, and that the most sophisticated technology was worthless if it served the wrong purposes. As Margaret started the car and began driving toward Austin, Ethan opened his notebook and began sketching new algorithms. Outside the windows, the Texas landscape rolled past. The same state where they'd first built their company, where they'd been betrayed and nearly destroyed, and where they would now begin building something better. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months, both Margaret and Ethan felt genuinely optimistic about the future. They'd survived the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy in corporate history, and they'd emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to create technology that would genuinely help people. Behind them, the medical center disappeared. In the rearview mirror, along with the last remnants of their traumatic experience. Ahead lay Austin, their new investors, their loyal employees, and the opportunity to prove that innovation and integrity could coexist in the modern business world. Margaret Chen and Ethan Rodriguez were ready to begin again. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.